Hi, you're watching Monday Night Live. My name is Brendan Malone, and on this episode, I'm going to be speaking to Richard McLeod. Richard has more than 20 years' experience as an immigration, refugee, and human rights lawyer, which has included involvement in some high-profile cases, such as the successful representation of Ahmed Zawi. Richard is a spokesperson for Lawyers for Vulnerable New Zealanders, a group of over 200 lawyers, which includes Queen's Counsels and prominent legal experts, who are all opposed to the End of Life Choice Act, which is attempting to legalise assisted suicide and euthanasia here in New Zealand. Tonight, Richard is going to be talking about what he sees as the dangers in the End of Life Choice Act and why he thinks New Zealanders should be voting no in the upcoming referendum. Without any further ado, let's have this very important conversation with Richard McLeod. Richard, thanks so much for being with us here this evening to discuss this really, really important topic of this End of Life Choice Act referendum that is before us now. Let's start at the very beginning, because it seems to me that this very euphemistically titled piece of legislation was perhaps the product of a bit of a questionable process of lawmaking. And why I say that is because I think about things like the fact that very late into the piece, I think it was a couple of years into the piece, David Seymour published his own very lengthy report about how you could make this bill safer, which straight away made me think, well, why wasn't it already safe when it came to Parliament? And secondly, there was a clause in there about grievous and irremediable being one of the criteria for euthanasia, which was removed, but it was removed at the last minute and only when it seemed like he wasn't going to be able to get it through Parliament any other way. Does this speak to you of a safe lawmaking process, or do you have questions about that aspect of this?
I think there have been a lot of concerns about the efficacy and the safety of this entire process. The first reading of this Act was in December 2017. It passed the first reading. It was sent off to Select Committee. The Select Committee took a long time to review it. They received 30,000 plus submissions, 95 or 96%, I think, of which were opposed. There was an uproar, particularly in the submissions, about the very loose criteria that extended not only to terminal illness, but to grievous and irremediable medical conditions. And what did that include? And many doctors went on the record and said, well, that extends to disabilities, that extends to mental illness. Mr. Seymour went up and down the country saying, no, it doesn't extend to mental illness, it's not possible, etc. But he came under such fire that even before the Select Committee could release its final report, he made these fundamental proposals to change his own bill, a bill that he'd been going up and down the country telling everybody was safe as houses and in perfect order. Suddenly he was making these drastic changes to it to make it safer. And one of those changes, of course, was to remove this whole criterion of grievous and irremediable medical conditions from the bill. And he said openly, well, that was really just to strike a political deal because it made it more palatable to my parliamentary colleagues. And so that particular political deal, to strike that criterion out of his act, I am sure in future litigation cases in this country is going to be something that litigants are going to point to and say, well, there was no logical rhyme or reason for removing that criterion other than that it was a political deal, and now we should expand it.
It's interesting because you often hear proponents of this bill saying, oh no, there won't be expansion, there won't be bracket creep, there won't be more categories, but it actually started with a much wider category and then narrowed again only to get passed, right?
Exactly. And some would say that was a deliberate strategy, and there's probably some merit in that argument. The idea is make it as horrifying as possible, and then right at the last minute, just sort of ease it back and say, look, we'll just keep it restrictive. The argument being that Mr. Seymour and those who are in favour of this particular piece of legislation, they know very well that all they need to do is to get this over the line, because once it's across the line, the trajectory, I should call it, of this particular type of law will take care of itself. And this really then brings up this whole discussion about, is this going to be the end of the conversation, or is this actually only going to be the beginning of the conversation? And some people call this the slippery slope argument. I actually just call it the logical progression argument about a euthanasia law and the safety of a euthanasia law. And I firmly believe what has been proven to be the case in multiple jurisdictions that have legalized euthanasia, and something that was prophesized, if you'd like to call it that, by the highest court in the land in the United Kingdom, the House of Lords, back in the mid-90s, in a euthanasia type case. They said quite prophetically that once you have a law that recognizes euthanasia as lawful in a particular set of circumstances, then it's difficult to see any logical basis for exclusion in other circumstances.
You've talked about this being a very serious, I mean, it's literally life or death we're talking about, giving a power that doctors have never had before, which is to be able to deliberately end the lives of the patients that they have under their care upon request. So it's very serious. Do you think we've had a fair, informed and balanced debate? Because we're now expected to vote on this. Do you think the public square discussion has been informed on this properly?
No, not at all. I don't think we've seen fair debate. I think you could probably say we've seen very little debate. They're now starting to have kind of breakfast debates. We've seen some TV channels just interview people who are on the supportive side of the equation and not on the opposition side. That's the real problem in New Zealand. This is an extremely serious issue. We have to be absolutely certain that we are going to get this right. We abolished capital punishment because we could not stand the prospect as a nation that we might get that one innocent person might be wrongfully killed. And that was, there were months of debate, and what we're now proposing is a system that is potentially going to lead to the deaths of hundreds and hundreds of New Zealanders on an annual basis, under a complete cloak of secrecy and a lack of transparency, where we're not going to even know the details of what has happened.
Can you unpack that? You say that's a pretty important statement you've just made. You say a cloak of secrecy. I would have assumed that this would be, because it's so serious, there'd be a public oversight, there'd be oversight committees. You're saying that's not the case?
No, it's like it's like playing a cricket game without the umpires. This is what this process is going to be. There is no contemporaneous mechanism under this process for reviewing the euthanasia process at all. Okay, all that we've got is a review committee at the end of the process, which basically gets reports from the registrar with very scant details, and then the review committee makes recommendations and it releases a report every year. And this is a really important issue, because it's what New Zealanders are not going to be told that concerns me the most about this process. We're not going to be told, for example, the ethnicity of patients who have been euthanized. We won't be told the personal or socio-economic circumstances of those people. We won't know, we won't be given their clinical records, and nor will the review committee for that matter. The review committee and the New Zealand public won't know what was the unbearable suffering that the particular people had. And we're not even going to know what steps, for example, doctors took to do their best to detect whether people were being coerced or pressured. We won't be told the name of the institution where it happened either.
So that's what data will be collected then?
That there was a death. So there will be forms that will be collected that will say that there was a death, and that the patient, how the patient died. In other words, they were given a lethal injection, or that they ingested it themselves, that the patient died, etc. and they'll say what the underlying cause, the underlying condition was. But we won't be told any of these other things. And we won't be told the name of the institution where it took place either. Imagine if capital punishment was reintroduced into New Zealand, right? And under the new execution regime, we wouldn't know anything about who was being executed. And basically every year there would be a government review committee that would publish a report, and the report would simply say, last year we executed 150 New Zealanders. We're not going to tell you their names. We're not going to tell you their ethnicity. We're not going to tell you their circumstances. We're not going to tell you what they did wrong that justified their execution. And we're not going to tell you where they were executed.
I can't get my head around this because, especially now, we live in the information age and we are drowning in reports, it seems, every other day. And now some of those reports are helpful, perhaps some of them are over the top, but it seems that even here, the fundamentals you'd want for safety and security and accountability are missing.
It's truly frightening. I mean, if you're going to have an effective review mechanism, like this review committee, then at the very least, you've got to ensure, and you want to make it secret. Okay, let's just assume you're going to have privacy. At the very least, let's make sure that that committee is told the full picture. But even that committee is going to be deprived of some of these most basic and fundamental pieces of information. So this is the whole problem. What have they got to hide? Why the need to cover up this whole process?
How did they get through? How did they get through Parliament then? How do you get something that seems to me like it's got more holes than an Irish sieve in it by the sounds of it? How do you get something like this out the other side of what is supposed to be, we've been told, a safe parliamentary process that's produced a very safe piece of legislation according to supporters?
That's the big question. How did our parliamentarians, or at least 69 of them, pass this? And if you really want to know what I think, I would say that this bill has been passed as a result of political posturing and political correctness, rather than as a result of our parliamentarians seriously sitting down to ask themselves the fundamental questions about how do we keep vulnerable New Zealanders safe under this law. If you listen to the third reading and the speeches that were made in Parliament, it was mostly just vacuous lip service to choice, with very little detail being thrashed out about, is this actually safe? And in most of the House committees that were formed and heard, most of the politicians didn't even turn up to those debates. They just gave their proxy votes.
This is serious then, and it seems to me that you've talked already about the media, and this is one area where you'd think there should be some more scrutiny and spotlighting on this aspect of it. But it seems you are someone who's appeared in the media yourself over the last couple of years on this issue. How do you feel about the media coverage and performance of this? Because I feel a little bit like perhaps we've had media outlets that have actually completely forgotten their core mission and have now become activists for the bill.
Many people are complaining about that. The media is actually just totally biased. I was on TV Breakfast just a month ago, and a lot of the comments that I saw on the Facebook page were basically just saying to John Campbell, just let the man speak, stop interrupting him, and stop trying to spend half your interview to get him to say what his personal views about euthanasia are. It seems to me that the media is more intent on shooting the messenger than listening to the message, and this is a very frustrating thing. I have my personal views on euthanasia. I certainly, I have religious views. I'm not ashamed or afraid to say that I have religious views, but I haven't made a single religious argument about this particular piece of legislation. My platform is as the spokesperson for a group of 200 New Zealand lawyers. Some of these lawyers are the finest legal minds in our country. We're talking about 9 or 10 Queen's Counsel, some of the top academics of our country, who have a variety of views about euthanasia. We don't poll them on their religious beliefs. We don't care whether they have religious beliefs or not. My co-spokesperson is an atheist, no problem. it's all that we care about is what do lawyers think about this particular piece of legislation, and every one of us is unanimous that this is a dangerous and defective piece of legislation, and that New Zealanders need to understand what they are actually being asked to vote on, because this is a real big problem, and New Zealanders need to ask themselves, how do we want to look as a country? What are we going to become as a country if we cross this Rubicon and if we vote it through for terminal illness?
One thing I hear from the other side of this debate a lot is that this is a much improved bill. It's certainly changed. Do you think it's been improved from where it was?
No. It's all that's happened is there have been the grievous and irremediable criterion has been removed for the moment, and we'll come back to that because it's definitely going to expand, and I'll tell you how. There's been a few extra safeguards, as they call them, put in, but they're just hopeless.
Let's talk about the safeguards, because you've raised that issue, and we hear this a lot. This bill's got safeguards. It's got safeguards. You don't have to worry. Why are you so concerned about this then?
It's not just the wealthy, the rich, and the privileged who are going to wake up and find themselves eligible for euthanasia and who will have their choice. It's going to be very vulnerable New Zealanders across the country who are terminally ill, who are going to find themselves in very vulnerable, this very vulnerable situation where they might be being denied proper health care, they might not be able to access palliative care, they may not be able to get pharmac funding, they may be a victim of elderly abuse, they might be being manipulated financially or psychologically by their family members, as 90,000 elderly New Zealanders experience at the moment. So we've got a whole list of people who are already going to be in vulnerable situations. And the question is, how does the Act protect those people from a situation such as their family pressuring or manipulating them into requesting euthanasia? This Act puts the whole burden of detecting and making an assessment whether a patient is being pressured or coerced onto one doctor, the first doctor who sees them, who may not even know them, who may not meet them, who might only meet them for a couple of times. And then the Act says to that doctor, all you have to do is to do your best to detect pressure in that person. Those are the words. Do your best. It's like a Kiwi euphemistic kind of language, just do your best, mate, to detect whether this patient is being pressured. And the only way that they can do their best is by talking to the person's usual doctors, which might be themselves. How many GPs do you know everything about a patient's family? Or they can talk to members of the patient's family that the patient allows them to speak to. So if the patient says, no, you can't talk to my family, then they're not going to be able to speak to the patient's family. So invariably, there's going to be problems with that. But there's even a bigger problem with this. And it comes down to the question of how many doctors in New Zealand want to be a part of this process. Because the latest polls of doctors show that 98% of palliative care doctors in New Zealand and Australia, for that matter, don't want to have anything to do with euthanasia. They don't want to participate in the process. 53 to 58% of our GPs are also strongly or totally opposed to euthanasia. What's the result of that going to be when it comes to this test for pressure? Well, what's going to happen is this. In the palliative sector, the vast majority of doctors are going to exercise their right of conscientious objection. And in the GP sector, at least half of our doctors, according to polls, are going to exercise their right of conscientious objection. When that happens under the Act, the patient is then transferred across to the SENZ group, the SCENZ group. This is a group of doctors who have put their hands up as being doctors who are willing to help people to end their lives under this Act. So it's going to become a SENZ doctor who will be the doctor who assesses the patient, because their usual doctor has exercised a conscientious objection right. Now, the SENZ doctor will have never met the patient before. Under the Act, the SENS doctor could even conduct their examinations and consultations with the patient by Skype. And this hapless patient is going to be referred to a doctor who is going to then have to make this assessment about whether a person they've never met and don't know is being pressured. How on earth are they going to do that? Now, the New Zealand Royal College of General Practitioners wrote to the Select Committee during the Select Committee process and said, we are not going to be able to detect coercion in every case. There are going to be wrongful deaths. This is what our own doctors are telling us. Even the court system can't detect whether people are being coerced or pressured. Weeks of hearing and examination and cross-examination, even we can't make up our minds and have a complete foolproof system for detecting it. And yet this Act places the burden on a single doctor who may not have ever met the patient and said, you just do your best.
So it seems to me
that's absurd.
That this is something that I've had my concerns about, is that the bill itself does not seem to be grounded in reality, the reality of human nature, even mistakes that get made around the whole issue of coercion and pressure. It seems to me, I've heard someone claim that this was the safest bill, but I've heard other lawyers who have said, no, there are actually other laws we have in other areas which have much safer tests against people being pressured than what this bill does. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
Oh, it's absolutely correct. If you ask any contract lawyer whether how this compares with the test for coercion under contract law, they would say, well, under contract law, it's quite a high standard for detecting whether a person has been is acting under duress in a contract, and even that very question could be thrashed out in a court over several weeks of hearing about whether a person is actually acting under duress or not. So what we're doing is we're transferring a very complex test into the medical sector and saying to one doctor, you do it, but don't worry, because you only have to do your best.
So you've said one doctor. The other side will come back and say, oh, but there's two doctors involved. Richard, what does that mean in practice, though?
The test for coercion and pressure is not part of the eligibility assessment. Okay, two doctors under the Act must determine whether the patient is eligible, and sometimes a third doctor if there are concerns about the patient's competence. So what I'm making clear to you is that the test for coercion and pressure is not under the eligibility criteria. The eligibility criteria don't mention it at all, and so it's only the first doctor under Section 11 of the Act who is required to do their best to determine whether there is coercion or pressure in the patient. That job does not fall upon the second doctor when the second doctor determines whether the person is eligible or not.
Okay, so it seems to me then, and this is troubling for me, is that this is like the opposite of what the government did, this Parliament did, with, say, the firearms legislation after the mosque attack, where what they did was they said, look, even though we think a group of law-abiding citizens can handle this particular thing safely, these guns, we're going to withdraw them from the whole community because the risk is too great to the whole community to have this practice in our community. With euthanasia, it seems they've done the exact opposite with that issue.
That's right. They have. There's no point in having a law and saying we've got safeguards in the law when there's just no effective way of making these safeguards work in reality. The consistent feedback which the Select Committee received about this draft Act and this particular provision about detecting pressure was that it's not going to work. It can't work in reality. How does a doctor determine whether any patient is being pressured by their family? What are they going to do? Are they going to search their bank records? Are they going to visit their property? Are they going to talk to every single family member in the family? They're not even allowed to unless the patient allows them.
So could you elaborate on that point? So you just said that they're only allowed to, speak to people that the patient lets them speak to. Is that right?
That's right. They can only speak to members of the patient's family that the patient allows them to speak to. So what are they going to do? Are they going to read the patient's will? These questions are very complex questions, but according to David Seymour, it's enough for a doctor just to do their best. Chris Pink, MP Chris Pink, put in a very comprehensive supplementary order paper trying to amend this particular provision. And he proposed that the whole process of detecting pressure should be transferred out of the medical profession and into the hands of an independent panel comprised of experts, people who could have a variety of powers for determining whether someone was being coerced or pressured. But that was voted down. And so we're left with what we've got. We're left with a very dangerous piece of legislation, which not only fails to protect the abused, but which then goes and shields the abusers. Okay, because we now have section 37.5 of the Act, which basically says you're going to be immune from criminal liability if you are acting in good faith and on reasonable grounds, that you basically cause, assist, or facilitate the death of a person under this Act. Cause, assist, or facilitate. Now, what is an abusive family member going to do when they see that loophole in the law? They're going to go, okay, so I can cause, assist, or facilitate mum or dad's death as long as I can say that I was acting in good faith and I believed on reasonable grounds that mum did want to die. Then I can take full advantage of that loophole in the law and encourage mum on a daily basis to hurry up and die. I can give her lots of literature and brochures and pamphlets on euthanasia, and talk about it with her every day, remind her about it every day. And finally, when I've browbeaten her into submission, I'll take her along to the doctor, and I'm just a person who's here in good faith believing that mum wants to die. So I get full criminal immunity under the Act. Nothing can be done against me. And don't forget, mum's going to sign a paper saying that she requests her own death. So I'll get away with it. Now, that's unacceptable. That creates a place of refuge in our criminal law for the very abusers that are abusing our elderly every year.
Now, you've talked about abuse there, but it seems to me there's also the issue of a mistaken diagnosis. So you get a misdiagnosis, and maybe it's too late to get the correct information before you make a decision. And number two would be even the way in which choices work in the real world. So I've often imagined a scenario where you might have, say, an older father who's diagnosed with cancer. He's got an adult daughter who comes to see the wife. He's sitting there one Saturday night watching rugby. She's talking away to mum, saying, I'm really worried about you. I'm concerned. How are you going to cope? How are you going to pay for the bills? How are you going to travel to and from the hospital for dad? She's trying to be kind to her parents, but her dad's sitting in the next room. He overhears it, and what does he think? I'm a burden on my family. And there seems there's no way you can actually protect against that.
There isn't. The Act talks about pressure or coercion from another person. This is really interesting. It doesn't talk about other types of coercion. What are the coercive forces alive and well in New Zealand? Okay, we know that there are the coercive forces of elderly abuse. That's a very strong coercive force. 90,000 people abused by their loved ones, by their family members, by the institutions in which they are living, etc. Then there are the more sort of subtle forms of abuse or coercion, like the situation that you just described, where people are just made to feel that they're a burden on their loved ones. There are the coercive forces of being lonely. 1 in 5 elderly New Zealanders identify as being extremely lonely, according to a University of Otago report a few years ago. There are the coercive forces of marginalisation from family or whānau. There are the coercive forces of failures in the healthcare system, people who have been neglected by the healthcare service. There are the coercive forces of market forces in the healthcare system. We've had a number of media personalities over the years champion the cause of people who have been denied pharmac funding that could keep them alive for years. We've seen it with breast cancer. We've just seen it this year with Keytruda. And now they are saying, we're not going to fund it. So that means that 1,800 people who are dying from lung cancer every year will no longer be able to get will not be able to get Keytruda funding from pharmac. that could keep them alive for years. There was a report that came out of Canada where it was commissioned independently, and it concluded just 2 years into the euthanasia regime there that the Canadian government could save conservatively $130 million a year through the euthanasia process. That was assuming that everybody died within a week of their natural death. Go and look at the story of Barbara Wagner in Oregon. Barbara Wagner was a 64-year-old lung cancer patient. Her doctor said, look, with this particular medication, if you get funding for it, it'll keep you alive for years. Her insurance company, which, by the way, was a state insurance company, it refused to fund her medication and instead offered her suicide pills for $50.
When supporters of the bill say things like, oh, no country's ever reversed it, you can see why it becomes actually incentivised, right? Because the economic outcome is, and you've got elderly who are increasing in number. The healthcare burden from the elderly, they consume the most resources, which is just life. But you can see all of a sudden you've got bureaucrats and others who are saying, but if we keep this law going, that will save, every 10 years about $1.4 billion in Canada, if that report's correct?
You could certainly say that there are strong economic reasons why a future government, or maybe even this government, is going to wake up very soon and go, we can save a vast amount of money by helping or encouraging elderly New Zealanders to hurry up and die, especially in the current economic climate that we're about to enter, and especially given the fact, as you pointed out, that we're going to have more and more elderly people. And not only are we going to have more of them, we're going to have a lot of them who are living longer and living sicker, and we just simply can't afford to keep them all alive. I'm sorry, that is going to become the social discourse that we're going to be seeing in years to come, is that we can't keep everybody alive. And don't think for a moment that this couldn't happen in New Zealand. This happened back in the mid-90s. Selwyn Manning, an investigative reporter, unveiled a conspiracy within the Ministry of Health, run by Jenny Shipley at the time, that had plotted out this way to save costs on funding for people with end-life renal failure. And what it did, it used a variety of screening tools and proposed to deny funding to people of certain categories, if they were intellectually handicapped, if they were blind, if they had a criminal conviction, and so on. And the Ministry of Health tried to keep it under wraps, but eventually it was exposed. So there you have it right there, a eugenically driven attempt by government to save costs by getting rid of certain categories of people 25 years ago in our own country. We are heading into a perfect storm. We've got we're going to have more and more elderly people. We don't have enough young people coming through. We can't afford to keep everybody alive. We're heading into probably the biggest economic crisis that we've ever faced as a country. And what are we going to do? We're now proposing to help predominantly elderly people to end their lives with euthanasia.
So you can see where that's going. It's interesting, isn't it? I read Carolise Trey's new book. In fact, I spoke to her on the show a couple of weeks ago. One of the things that I was really surprised by, and she had the whole original newspaper clipping from the New York Times about the New York Times in the 30s writing about the German euthanasia program, and the wording, the phrasing, the arguments, it was astounding how they're almost identical to what we're hearing today around this issue. So talk of eugenics, I don't think is unreasonable at all.
Malcolm Muggeridge wrote several decades after the Holocaust. He said it only takes 3 decades to transform a war crime into an act of compassion. That was what he was seeing already unveiling in Belgium and the Netherlands. People think that euthanasia is going to be some kind of extreme option way out here at the end of the spectrum. It's only going to be brought in the most extreme cases. This law makes euthanasia a legally enforceable right. It becomes a valid healthcare service, a legal entitlement. It's not just decriminalizing it, it's making it a right that people have the right to access. So the Ministry of Health is going to promote this right. Why wouldn't it? And this is how laws like this become slippery slopes. Because New Zealand, as you know, New Zealanders hate discrimination. We hate the notion that that a government is giving just a very few people this particular right and is denying it to whole categories or groups of other people. And this is how it plays out, and it's how it's playing out in other countries where euthanasia has been legalized. Because as soon as you say, look, we're only going to give this right to terminally ill people in extreme pain, well, then you're going to have a non-terminally ill person in extreme pain saying, well, why shouldn't I get that right? And then you're going to have someone saying, well, why should it just be physical pain? Why can't it be mental pain? So then you're going to expand it to people who are mentally ill. And then you'll have people say, well, why should it be denied to children if adults can have it and they're in unbearable pain? So it'll be naturally expanded to children. And then, of course, ultimately, as we're now seeing just last week in the Netherlands, we've got this politician who's just tabled this new bill. Why shouldn't it be available to anybody over the age of 75 who's just tired of living? So this is practical. This is not just a theoretical argument. Okay, we have seen an expansion in every country that has legalized euthanasia. We have seen an expansion of the laws. We've seen it in Canada. Canada's euthanasia law is only 4 years old. No sooner had the ink dried on that law that there were multiple court challenges arguing that it was discriminating against non-terminally ill Canadians, people who are chronically ill, people who were disabled, etc. What's the result of that? Well, just a few months ago, the Canadian Parliament has now been tabled a new bill, a government-sponsored bill, to expand the law. It's expanding the law to not just terminally ill people, but to non-terminally ill people, chronically sick people, disabled people, and so on.
That's legal expansion, which happens. I want to talk about the overseas experience in just a second, because I've heard people claim it's not an issue. But before that, there's also expansion in practice, right? So even if the law doesn't grow, people will find new and creative ways to fit various people into the categories that already exist.
The risk of expansion is not just a legislative expansion. It's what we call interpretative expansion. So when you have laws like the ones in the Netherlands and in Belgium, which are already quite liberal at the very beginning, you see, the question is, well, then how do we interpret those laws? And they're interpreted very broadly. And what happens is that over time, they become interpreted even more expansively than they had originally. So even though the Netherlands and Belgian laws were intended to be mostly for terminally ill people, in reality, doctors have said, well, it can also expand to non-terminally ill people, to people with chronic illness, to people with mental illness, to people with blindness, to people with dementia. It's especially over the last sort of 8 or 9 years, there has been a staggering increase in the number of dementia patients in the Netherlands and Belgium who have been euthanized on request. But how do you do that with a dementia patient? Well, you do it through what's called an advance directive, where 5-10 years earlier, they say, if I get to this particular point, I would like to be euthanized. But how do we know that the Euthanasia Act is even a voluntary one? And this was played out in the Netherlands just 2 years ago, where the family of a woman with dementia had to actually hold her down physically because she had refused to be euthanized, and her doctor then injected her with a lethal dose of pentobarbital and killed her. So this is the problem with these kinds of laws, even in countries that are already quite expensive. They are interpreted very widely.
And on that point of advanced care directives, because I know some people have said, we don't have that in our law, the End of Life Choice Act, but I do know, and I've heard advocates of this law who have said either we want this in the law or they've expressed extreme disappointment that it's not there. So we know that this is something that's already wanted. It's
only a matter of time. I can tell you as a lawyer, there is no doubt that someone who is going to challenge this law and say, well, this is unacceptable to me. This discriminates against me because you have to be, less than 6 months to live. Well, I've got dementia. I've got 5 years to live, maybe 3 years. Why can't I make an advanced directive, which is my right under the common law? Why can't I have that right and say I would like to be euthanized at a particular point in time? And it's going to be very, very difficult for the Crown to defend those types of proceedings.
So when you say crossing the Rubicon, you really mean once you cross it, You're only heading in one direction, because often I hear supporters of the bill say, "Nah, overseas it's been fine. People are inflating the problems. There's no issues overseas." Is that the case?
Well, first of all, it's a total lie to say that there have not been problems overseas and abuses overseas, and I'll tell you what they are in just a moment. But yes, it's the other problem with laws overseas is that there is only one trajectory of a euthanasia law. David Seymour says, well, no country that's ever had a euthanasia law has ever gone back. Well, that's because there's only one way to go with euthanasia laws, and that's expansion. Once you cross the Rubicon, there is no going back, because you are now entering a situation where everybody's going to say, well, you can't discriminate against all of these other people just for these particular group of people. It's got to be expanded. That's been the experience in the Netherlands. It's been the experience in Belgium. It's certainly the experience we're seeing right now in Canada. It was the experience we've seen recently in Colombia. Colombia, just in 2018, expanded it to children over the age of 6. Belgium in 2014 expanded it to children, no age limit whatsoever.
Okay, so we've talked about consent for adults without pressure. How the heck in law can you guarantee informed consent from a 7-year-old or an 8-year-old or a 9-year-old or a 10-year-old?
Well, that's right. You can't. In the Netherlands, they through a protocol called the Groningen Protocol. So it's not even really a proper law, but it was a protocol that was put in place soon after their law was enacted, and that basically allows a doctor to euthanize severely disabled newborn infants. So these are like children who have got spina bifida and so forth. So it's just another example of an interpretative expansion. The other problems that we've seen emerging out of Belgium and the Netherlands in particular in the last 8 to 10 years have been an increasing number of people being euthanized with mental illness. Particularly in Belgium, it's been a real problem with psychiatrists, arranging the euthanasia of people with schizophrenia, bipolar disorders, psychotic illnesses, and so on. Growing and growing numbers of people. Another example of interpretative expansion, because these kinds of numbers of mentally ill patients were never being euthanized before. So now it's possible, and we're seeing cases of depressed young 23-year-olds who are being euthanized on request because they're depressed. People being euthanized. One man was euthanized in Belgium because he was depressed after a botched sex change operation. One prisoner who was being treated like an animal in prison was approved euthanasia because he said, well, I don't have any life here in prison. In the end, he didn't get it, but he was approved it. And this is what we're seeing. More and more and more people will say, well, why shouldn't it be expanded? And so I say to New Zealanders, if you really think that we are just going to be able to limit this to terminal illness as everybody's promising, then you're deluding yourselves, because I guarantee that this will not be the case. I guarantee that in 5, 10, 15 years' time, your country will look very, very different to what you could ever have imagined it would be.
Okay, so
I can talk about abuses if you want.
Well, yeah, that's what I'm interested in is the abuses of these laws. How have some of the overseas experiences played out? Again, we've heard there's no problems.
Well, I mean, it's just patently false to make those claims. So, I mean, in the Netherlands, just 2 years ago, this is a country where they're euthanizing children, they're euthanizing newborn babies, they're euthanizing dementia patients and psychiatric patients and depressed people. We had this case of the Dutch woman with dementia who was held down by her family while her doctor administered a lethal injection against her will. Okay, across the border in Belgium, where they're euthanizing children and psychiatric patients, we had a case just a few years ago where the Belgian Review Committee, so this is the same type of committee we're going to have here, it was exposed as corrupt by one of its own members, okay, a whistleblower from the Review Committee who basically said, this committee is breaking the law. It's approving wrongful deaths, and it's ensuring that the doctors who commit those atrocities get away with it, get total impunity. And the person who was the whistleblower was a member of that committee, and then said it's basically an industry in Belgium where the players in the industry just help each other. So that's those two countries. Let's look at Canada. Okay, in Canada we've got the case of Roger Foley. This was a man who was secretly pressured by hospital staff to choose euthanasia. He recorded the conversation that's been used there. What about the case of Candice Lewis, a 25-year-old Canadian woman with spina bifida and chronic illness? The doctors didn't pressure her. What they did instead was they pressured her mother within earshot of Candice to say, why doesn't your daughter request euthanasia? And when her mother said, well, we don't want that, they said, well, you're just being selfish. What about Sean Taggart? I think it was just last year. He suffered from ALS, and basically the Canadian healthcare system refused to pay for all the care that he really needed for this chronic condition that he had. And in the end, it offered to pay for his euthanasia, of course, and in the end he took it. So this is a man who basically was helped to be euthanized by a system that couldn't or wouldn't care for him. What about the fact in May 2018, the Quebec College of Practitioners wrote to the Minister of Health and said, we have a serious problem in Quebec. We have a shortage of palliative care practitioners and facilities here. And what we're concerned about is that thousands of people in Quebec, because they can't access palliative care, are going to be choosing assisted dying, euthanasia instead. Then, of course, in April last year, the UN Special Rapporteur on Disabilities visited Canada and issued a very damning report saying that she was extremely concerned to hear multiple reports coming out of Canada about disabled people being pressured by hospital staff and so on into requesting euthanasia. So don't tell me that there's been no problems overseas. Every jurisdiction that has legalized this has seen abuses, and these are just some examples that I'm giving you.
Okay, a couple of questions to finish with. It seems to me some people might be thinking, okay, well, I'll vote for the referendum, I'll vote yes, and then we can fix these problems later. But can that be done or not?
It can't be fixed. I mean, this is the problem, is that New Zealanders have been asked to pass the final form of this act. This is it. This is what we've got. This is the result of 3 or 4 years of select committees, submissions, and thrashing it out, and David Seymour making at least 1 or 2 attempts to drastically alter it. This is it. This is what we've got. This is what our Parliament has now dumped on the New Zealand public and said, okay, we think it's good to go. Now you guys can decide whether you want to pass it or not. There are a lot of dangers with this act. I've only touched on a few of them. There are many others. And New Zealanders, I don't even think, really understand what they are passing, and if they do pass it. And polls, people say, well, 75% of New Zealanders are supportive of euthanasia. That's fine. It may be the case that New Zealanders are supportive of the idea of euthanasia, but if they knew what this act could do and how defective and dangerous it was, then those polls are going to change overnight. Don't forget that this is not, the referendum question is not, do you support euthanasia? It is, do you support the End of Life Choice Act? And what I'm saying to New Zealanders is, I have yet to see a law in any of these jurisdictions that has safely implemented a euthanasia law. And what we're trying to do here is to wrap a law around euthanasia. This law certainly doesn't do it. It is way, way, way off the mark. You can't pass this law. It's just too dangerous.
In a sentence or two, just to wrap up with Richard, what would your message be to to people who are potentially sitting on the fence, who are undecided, not sure how they should vote?
I would say that they speak of choice, but this isn't really about choice. I think that the whole idea of choice in this act is really just an illusion, actually. There's no choice in ending the life of a person whom we've neglected or we can't take care of. There's no compassion or dignity in ending the life of an elderly lady who's been neglected and abused by her family. And there's certainly no compassion and dignity in ending the life of a person that we can't can't adequately care for because Pharmac won't fund their treatment or because they can't access proper palliative care. New Zealanders need to ask themselves, is choice really a level playing field in our country? Because to say that you're giving people choice assumes that everybody already has the same choices. We don't. This is a deeply divided and afflicted country when it comes to what people really have in the way of choice. And this law is going to apply to everybody in New Zealand, not just the rich and powerful who have plenty of money and private insurance and they're the ones who will get choice. It's going to equally apply to the poor, the weak, the vulnerable and the defenceless, people who have little or no choice.
Richard, one last thing perhaps just to finish with. I often hear people saying, oh, this is just about a bunch of religious people trying to hold us back with their religious dogmas. Is that what this really is about, or is there something more here?
I'm a religious person, proud to be. I'm a Catholic and I love my faith. I'm also a human rights lawyer with 25 years of experience in defending vulnerable people against the state, which is what I'm really doing here. I'm also a member of 200 lawyers who are deeply concerned about this particular act, and many of whom have little or no religious views. I don't even know what half of their views are. But we are unanimous in our condemnation of this particular piece of legislation and the dangers that it's going to bring to New Zealand. And we are unanimous in wanting to warn New Zealanders, don't do it, because you won't believe what kind of country we're going to turn into if this passes into law.
Richard McLeod, thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us tonight and to discuss, in a very sobering conversation, really, this profoundly important issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
When we wake, hear the birds and see the sun. Side by side our fears are done. All the good times just begun. We know what we have, let's hold on tight. Found what we're looking for in life. Call us crazy, but things are finally right. With you and I, the future is bright.